Anthony drove home from his office. After 14 hours of preparing for a major federal case, all he wanted was to sink into his couch and unwind. The streets of downtown were nearly empty at this hour, just past 10 p.m. on a Tuesday. His silver sedan cruised smoothly as he mentally reviewed tomorrow's agenda. The flash of blue and red lights in his rearview mirror interrupted his thoughts. Anthony checked his speedometer. He was going exactly the speed limit. He hadn't changed lanes improperly or run any lights. With a sigh, he pulled over to the shoulder, placing both hands on the steering wheel where they would be visible. This wasn't the first time he'd been stopped for no apparent reason. At 42, Anthony had experienced this scenario more times than he cared to remember. As a black man in America, he knew the drill. Stay calm. Be respectful. Make no sudden movements. The officer approached, flashlight beam sweeping through Anthony's car windows before settling harshly on his face. Anthony squinted against the glare but maintained his composure. License and registration, the officer demanded without preamble. No greeting, no explanation for the stop. May I ask why I'm being pulled over, officer? Anthony asked politely, his voice steady despite the familiar knot forming in his stomach. Just give me your license and registration. The officer's tone had hardened, his hand resting casually on his holster. I'll get them right now, but I'd like to know the reason for this stop, Anthony persisted, still calm but firm. The officer, whose nameplate read Officer Reynolds, leaned down, his face now visible in the dim light. He was young, maybe early 30s, with a rigid jaw and cold eyes. You made an illegal lane change back there. Anthony knew he hadn't, but arguing would only escalate the situation. I'll get my documents from the glove compartment now, he said clearly, telegraphing his movements before reaching slowly across to the passenger side. As he handed over his license and registration, Anthony noticed Reynolds' expression shift subtly as he read the name. You in a rush to get somewhere, Mr. Anthony Wilson? Reynolds asked, emphasizing the name as if testing its authenticity. Just heading home after work, officer. Reynolds studied the license longer than necessary. This is a nice car for someone from this neighborhood. Where do you work? The implication was clear, and it stung despite Anthony's years of experience with such assumptions. I work downtown, at the federal courthouse. Doing what? Maintenance? The officer's smirk was barely concealed. Anthony took a deep breath. I'm an attorney. Reynolds laughed, a short, dismissive sound. Right. Step out of the vehicle, please. May I ask why that's necessary? Step out of the car now, Reynolds repeated, his hand moving back to his holster. I smell something suspicious. Anthony knew there was nothing to smell. He didn't drink, smoke, or use any substances. But he also knew that in this moment, compliance was his safest option. He opened the door slowly and stepped out, standing straight in his well-tailored suit that had begun to wrinkle after his long workday. Turn around, hands against the vehicle, Reynolds ordered. Officer, I don't consent to a search, Anthony stated clearly, knowing his rights even as he followed the directive to turn around. Spread your legs. Reynolds kicked at Anthony's ankles, forcing his stance wider than necessary. You people always think you know the law. Anthony felt the officer's rough hands patting him down, checking his pockets. His briefcase was still in the car, containing confidential case files he was preparing for tomorrow's proceedings. Nothing here, Reynolds muttered, sounding almost disappointed. But I'm still not convinced about you. Got any warrants? No, I do not, Anthony replied evenly. Reynolds returned to his patrol car with Anthony's license, leaving him standing by the roadside. The few passing cars slowed to look at the scene, a black man in a suit, hands now by his sides, waiting beside his vehicle while a police officer ran his information. Minutes stretched uncomfortably. Anthony remained still, knowing that any movement might be misinterpreted. He thought about his position, his years of education, his role in the justice system, and how none of it shielded him from moments like this. Reynolds eventually returned, his demeanor unchanged. "Your taillight's out," he said, contradicting his earlier claim about an illegal lane change. "My taillight is functioning properly," Anthony responded. "I checked all my lights just yesterday." "Are you calling me a liar?" Reynolds stepped closer, invading Anthony's personal space. "I'm simply stating a fact," Anthony said. "If you'd like to show me the taillight that's out, I'd appreciate it." Instead of responding to this reasonable request, Reynolds pulled his handcuffs from his belt. "Turn around. You're being detained for disorderly conduct and interfering with a police officer." "That's absurd," Anthony said, his composure finally cracking slightly. "I've been completely cooperative. Hands behind your back. Now." The order brooked no argument. As the cold metal closed around his wrists, Anthony asked quietly, "Am I under arrest?" "You're being detained while I search your vehicle," Reynolds replied, the distinction meaningless in practical terms at that moment. "I do not consent to a search of my vehicle," Anthony repeated firmly. "You have no probable cause." "We'll see about that." Reynolds guided him roughly to the patrol car and placed him in the back seat before returning to search Anthony's sedan. From his confined position, Anthony watched as the officer rummaged through his belongings, opening his briefcase and flipping through the documents inside. When Reynolds pulled out a leather credential wallet and opened it, his entire body language changed. The officer stood frozen for a moment, then hurriedly returned everything to the car. When he opened the patrol car door, his face had lost its arrogant sneer. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding," Reynolds said, his voice notably different. "Is that so?" Anthony responded, his hands still cuffed behind him. Reynolds uncuffed him quickly. "You're free to go, Mr. Wilson." "And what exactly changed in the last 5 minutes?" Anthony asked, rubbing his wrists. Reynolds couldn't meet his eyes. "I saw your Federal Prosecutor credentials." Anthony straightened his jacket. "So when you thought I was just a black man in a nice car, I deserved to be handcuffed and detained without cause. But now that you know I'm a Federal Prosecutor, suddenly there's been a misunderstanding?" The officer had no response. "Officer Reynolds," Anthony said, his voice firm but controlled, "I'll need your badge number and the name of your supervising officer." Reynolds' face paled. "Listen, I was just doing my job." "No," Anthony interrupted. "Your job is to protect and serve all citizens equally. What you were doing was profiling and harassment." Anthony stood his ground as Officer Reynolds shifted uncomfortably from one foot to another. The night had grown colder, but it wasn't the temperature making Reynolds sweat. "I'll be filing a formal complaint," Anthony said, his voice leveled despite the anger and humiliation burning inside him. "And I expect it will be taken seriously." "Look, we can handle this between us," Reynolds suggested, his authoritative tone replaced by something approaching nervousness. "No need to make this official." Anthony shook his head. "This isn't about you and me. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to someone else who might not have federal credentials to protect them." Reynolds' radio crackled with a dispatcher's voice, breaking the tense silence. After responding briefly, he turned back to Anthony. "You're free to go, Mr. Wilson." "I'm aware of that," Anthony replied. "I was free to go the moment you pulled me over without cause." As Anthony returned to his car, he noticed his hands were shaking slightly. The adrenaline that had kept him composed during the encounter was wearing off, leaving behind a familiar exhaustion. This wasn't his first experience with profiling, but it was perhaps the most blatant in recent years. Once in his vehicle, Anthony sat motionless for several moments. Reynolds remained in his patrol car, likely hoping Anthony would simply drive away and forget the incident. Instead, Anthony took out his phone and documented everything while the details were fresh: the time, location, badge number, and exact sequence of events. The next morning, Anthony arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. His case preparation had been interrupted by last night's incident, and he needed the extra time to center himself. The federal courthouse, with its imposing columns and broad steps, had always represented justice to him. Today, it felt like a reminder of how far that ideal still had to travel. His colleague Thomas noticed Anthony's subdued mood immediately when they met in the hallway. "Rough night?" Thomas asked. Anthony briefly recounted the previous evening's events. Thomas's expression darkened as he listened. "That's completely unacceptable," Thomas said when Anthony finished. "Are you filing a complaint?" "Already started the paperwork," Anthony confirmed. "But you know how these things usually go." Thomas nodded grimly. They both knew that complaints against officers rarely resulted in meaningful consequences. "Maybe this time will be different," Thomas suggested. "Given your position." "That's exactly the problem," Anthony interrupted. "Why should my position matter? What about the delivery driver who gets pulled over in that same spot? Or the student driving home late from studying? They deserve the same treatment I'm demanding." Thomas had no answer. He simply placed a supportive hand on Anthony's shoulder before they parted ways to their respective offices. Throughout the morning, Anthony struggled to focus on his case files. The faces of defendants and witnesses blurred together as his mind kept returning to Reynolds' smirk when he'd asked if Anthony worked in maintenance. Just before lunch, Anthony received a call from the police department. The person on the line identified himself as Captain Russell, Officer Reynolds' commanding officer. "Mr. Wilson, I understand there was an incident last night involving one of my officers," Captain Russell began, his tone carefully neutral. "That's correct," Anthony replied. "Officer Reynolds has provided his account, and I'd like to hear yours. Would you be available to come in and discuss this matter?" Anthony considered his packed schedule, the case he needed to prepare for, the witnesses he needed to interview. Then he thought about all the people who couldn't put their lives on hold to pursue justice after such incidents. "I'll be there," he said firmly. "This afternoon." The police station bustled with activity when Anthony arrived that afternoon. Officers moved purposefully through the hallways, some glancing curiously at him in his crisp suit. At the front desk, Anthony stated his business and was directed to wait. 20 minutes later, a door opened, and a tall man with graying hair approached. "Mr. Wilson? I'm Captain Russell. Thank you for coming." His handshake was firm, his expression unreadable. Anthony was led to a small conference room rather than an office, a neutral space. Officer Reynolds was noticeably absent. "Coffee?" Captain Russell offered, gesturing to a pot in the corner. "No, thank you," Anthony replied. "I'd prefer we get straight to the matter at hand." Captain Russell nodded, taking a seat across from him. "I've reviewed Officer Reynolds' report and the dashboard camera footage from last night." Anthony raised an eyebrow. "And?" "The footage doesn't align with Officer Reynolds' written account," Russell admitted, his tone measured. "There was no illegal lane change, and your taillight was functioning properly." Anthony wasn't surprised, but hearing this confirmation still brought a wave of vindication. Officer Reynolds claims he had reasonable suspicion based on a vehicle matching the description of one involved in a recent incident, Russell continued. "My sedan? A silver Toyota?" Anthony asked skeptically. "One of the most common vehicles on the road?" Russell's mouth tightened. I didn't say his explanation was satisfactory. "What happens now?" Anthony asked, leaning forward slightly. "Officer Reynolds has been placed on administrative duty while we conduct a full investigation," Russell replied. "We're also reviewing his previous traffic stops for patterns." Anthony studied the captain's face. "This isn't his first complaint, is it?" Russell hesitated before answering. "No. There have been others." "How many?" 3 in the past 18 months, Russell admitted. None resulted in disciplinary action due to insufficient evidence. Or insufficient will to act, Anthony suggested. When Russell didn't respond, he continued, "What's different now? Is it because I'm a federal prosecutor? Because there's video evidence? Or because you're concerned about media attention?" The captain's expression hardened. "Mr. Wilson, I understand your frustration. But I want to assure you that I take these matters seriously, regardless of who files the complaint." "Then prove it," Anthony challenged. "Don't just suspend Reynolds temporarily. Address the systemic issues that allow officers like him to repeatedly harass people based on their skin color." "That's beyond my authority," Russell said. "No, it's exactly your authority," Anthony countered. "You set the tone for your officers. You decide what behavior is acceptable and what isn't." An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Finally, Captain Russell spoke. "What exactly are you looking for here, Mr. Wilson?" Anthony considered the question carefully. He could push for Reynolds' termination, but would that solve the underlying problem? Would it prevent the next incident? Or would it simply make him feel better temporarily while allowing the system to continue unchanged? "I want accountability," Anthony said finally. "Not just for this incident, but for the pattern it represents. And I want change, real, measurable change in how your officers interact with the community they're supposed to protect." Captain Russell's eyes met his. "That's a tall order." "It shouldn't be," Anthony replied evenly. "It should be the minimum expectation." As Anthony left the police station, the afternoon sun warmed his face, contrasting with the chill he'd felt inside. His phone buzzed, a text from his boss, District Attorney Eleanor Hayes, "Need to see you. My office. ASAP." Anthony's stomach tightened. News traveled fast, especially in legal circles. He drove directly to the federal building, his mind racing through possibilities. Would Eleanor advise him to drop the complaint? Would this affect his standing at work? When he entered Eleanor's office, she was on the phone. She motioned for him to sit while finishing her call. "That was the police commissioner," she said after hanging up. "Word of your incident has reached his desk." Anthony sat straighter. "I filed a formal complaint this morning." "I know," Eleanor replied. "And now I'm hearing about it from multiple channels." Her expression was hard to read. "Tell me what happened." "Everything." Anthony recounted the events in detail, keeping his tone professional despite the emotions still simmering beneath the surface. Eleanor listened without interruption, her eyes never leaving his face. "Has this happened to you before?" she asked when he finished. "Yes," Anthony admitted. "Though not usually this blatant." Eleanor nodded slowly. "The commissioner wants to meet with both of us tomorrow morning." "Both of us?" Anthony questioned. "This is my personal complaint. It stopped being purely personal when Officer Reynolds discovered you work for this office," Eleanor explained. "Now it involves questions about how law enforcement treats the legal community." "That's exactly the problem," Anthony said, frustration edging into his voice. "My profession shouldn't matter. This should be treated with the same seriousness regardless of who I am." Eleanor leaned forward. "I agree completely. And that's precisely why I want to be there. Not to take over your complaint, but to make it clear that our office supports accountability across the board." Anthony considered this. "What's your honest assessment? Will anything meaningful come from this?" Eleanor sighed. "Truthfully, these situations often end with minimal consequences. But occasionally, they create opportunities for real change." She paused. "The fact that the commissioner called me directly suggests this might be one of those opportunities." Anthony nodded, cautiously hopeful. "There's something else," Eleanor added. "Local news got wind of this. A reporter called asking for comment about a federal prosecutor being racially profiled. I didn't contact any media, Anthony said quickly. I know. But these stories have a way of finding the light. Eleanor studied him. The question is, how do you want to handle it? You could decline comment, give a brief statement, or use this platform to address the larger issue. Anthony hadn't considered this angle. His natural instinct was to keep his private life private. But perhaps this wasn't just about him anymore. I need to think about it, he finally replied. Of course, Eleanor said. Whatever you decide, the office will support you. But decide soon, the reporter is on deadline. As Anthony left Eleanor's office, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from an unknown number. Mr. Wilson, this is Tyler from Channel 7 News. Would you be willing to speak with us about your experience with Officer Reynolds? The elevator doors closed in front of him as Anthony stared at the message, weighing his options and responsibilities. Anthony didn't respond to the reporter immediately. Instead, he drove to his favorite coffee shop, seeking a quiet corner to think. The barista greeted him by name and prepared his usual order without asking. Finding a secluded table, Anthony weighed his options. Speaking publicly could amplify the impact of his complaint, potentially forcing more substantial changes within the department. But it would also thrust him into a spotlight he'd never sought, possibly affecting his career and personal life. His phone buzzed again, his sister Denise calling. I just saw a blurb on the news website, she said when he answered. They didn't use your name, but said a federal prosecutor filed a complaint against an officer for racial profiling. That's you, isn't it? Yes, Anthony admitted. How did they describe it? Vaguely. Just that an incident occurred during a traffic stop. Her voice softened. Are you okay? I'm fine, he assured her, though the tension in his shoulders suggested otherwise. You don't sound fine, Denise observed. Talk to me. Anthony sighed. I'm trying to decide whether to speak to the media. What does your gut tell you? That's the problem, Anthony replied. Part of me wants to keep my head down and handle this through official channels. But another part feels responsible to speak up because I have a platform most people don't. Remember what Dad always said? Denise asked gently. Anthony smiled slightly. Their father, a community organizer who'd marched with Dr. King, had often quoted, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. I know, Anthony said. But there are other ways to make change besides news interviews. True, Denise agreed. Whatever you decide, I'm behind you. After they hung up, Anthony noticed a family at a nearby table, a black couple with two young boys around 10 years old. The boys were laughing, carefree in a way that made Anthony's heart ache. He wondered how many years they had before they'd experienced their first random stop, their first baseless suspicion, their first lesson in keeping their hands visible and their voices calm. Anthony made his decision. He texted the reporter, I'm willing to speak about my experience, but I want to focus on systemic issues, not just my individual case. The response came immediately, absolutely. When can we meet? They arranged an interview for the following morning, before his meeting with the police commissioner. Anthony then called Eleanor to inform her of his decision. Are you certain? She asked. Once you go public, there's no taking it back. I'm certain, Anthony replied. But I'd like your advice on how to frame this constructively. Focus on accountability and reform, not retribution, Eleanor suggested. And be prepared for backlash. Not everyone will appreciate you speaking out. I know, Anthony said quietly. But I keep thinking about what would have happened if I didn't have those credentials in my briefcase. After the call, Anthony finished his coffee and headed home. Tomorrow would be challenging, but for the first time since the incident, he felt a sense of purpose replacing his anger. This wasn't just about Officer Reynolds anymore. It was about something much larger. Morning arrived with a flurry of text messages from colleagues who had seen the brief news item about an unnamed federal prosecutor filing a complaint. Anthony replied to a few, then prepared himself for the day ahead. The Channel 7 news studio was smaller than Anthony had imagined. Tyler, the reporter who had contacted him, was young but professional, shaking Anthony's hand warmly before guiding him to a small interview set. "We'll keep this straightforward," Tyler explained. "I'll ask about what happened, then we can discuss the broader implications. We'll air the segment tonight, but release clips online after we wrap up." Anthony nodded, feeling unexpectedly nervous as the camera operator adjusted lighting. Rolling in 3, 2, 1. The camera's red light blinked on. "I'm here with Assistant U.S. Attorney Anthony Wilson, who recently filed a complaint against a local police officer for racial profiling and misconduct during a traffic stop," Tyler began. "Mr. Wilson, can you tell us what happened that night?" Anthony recounted the events calmly, careful to stick to facts rather than emotional characterizations. When he described being handcuffed, he noticed the camera operator's slight grimace. "The officer's demeanor completely changed when he found your credentials," Tyler observed. "What does that tell us?" "It tells us that dignity and respect shouldn't be reserved only for people with certain titles," Anthony replied. "Every citizen deserves fair treatment under the law. Some might suggest you're receiving special attention because of your position. How do you respond?" "They're absolutely right," Anthony said frankly. "And that's precisely the problem. My complaint is being taken seriously because I'm a federal prosecutor. But what about the delivery driver who gets pulled over without cause? Or the teacher? Or the nurse? Their complaints often vanish into administrative black holes." The interview continued for 15 minutes, touching on police accountability, community relations, and potential reforms. Anthony was surprised at how easily the words came, fueled by years of observations both personal and professional. "Final question," Tyler said. "What outcome are you hoping for?" Anthony paused, considering. "Justice for one incident is important, but insufficient. I hope this leads to meaningful accountability measures and better training. Most officers want to serve their communities with honor. The system should help them do that, not protect those who don't." After the cameras stopped rolling, Tyler thanked him. "That was powerful stuff. We'll air the full segment tonight at 6. Anthony checked his watch. Just enough time to reach his meeting with the police commissioner. Arriving at the municipal building, Anthony found Eleanor waiting in the lobby. "How did the interview go?" she asked. "Better than expected," Anthony replied. "I hope I struck the right balance." Eleanor nodded. "Ready for round 2? They were escorted to a conference room where Police Commissioner Harris waited. Beside him sat another man Anthony instantly recognized, Chief Judge William Montgomery from the federal court, his boss's boss. "Mr. Wilson," the commissioner greeted him. "Thank you for coming." Anthony glanced questioningly at Eleanor, who appeared equally surprised by the judge's presence. "I asked Judge Montgomery to join us," Commissioner Harris explained. "Given the seriousness of this situation, I thought it appropriate to include leadership from both our institutions." The atmosphere in the room was charged with tension as they all took their seats, the unspoken weight of Anthony's complaint hanging between them. Commissioner Harris opened a folder in front of him. "I've reviewed the dash cam footage, Officer Reynolds' report, and Captain Russell's preliminary investigation findings." His voice was measured, professional. "I want to begin by apologizing for your experience, Mr. Wilson." Anthony nodded but remained silent, waiting. "Officer Reynolds' actions that night were unacceptable," Harris continued. "There was no valid reason for the stop, the search, or the detention. And yet it happened," Anthony observed. "As it happens to countless others who don't have my resources or platform." Judge Montgomery cleared his throat. That's why I asked to be included in this meeting. This incident raises serious questions about the relationship between our justice institutions. Eleanor leaned forward. What are you proposing? We've been discussing options, Commissioner Harris replied. Simply disciplining Officer Reynolds addresses one symptom, not the underlying problem. I'm listening, Anthony said. Harris exchanged glances with Judge Montgomery before continuing. We're proposing a joint task force between the prosecutor's office, the courts, and the police department to review our traffic stop protocols, complaint procedures, and accountability measures. Who would lead this task force? Eleanor asked. We were hoping Mr. Wilson might consider taking that role, Judge Montgomery said, looking directly at Anthony. Anthony was caught off guard. Me? You have unique perspective from both sides of the system, the judge explained. And you've demonstrated both personal investment and professional restraint in handling this situation. Anthony's mind raced. Was this a genuine opportunity for change, or an attempt to silence his complaint by absorbing him into the system? What powers would this task force have, he asked. Would our recommendations be implemented, or simply filed away? I would commit to implementing any reasonable recommendations, Commissioner Harris stated. And I'd be willing to put that in writing. And Officer Reynolds? Anthony asked. Harris's expression tightened slightly. He's been placed on unpaid administrative leave pending a full hearing. Given his record and the evidence in this case, termination is likely. Anthony nodded, considering. I appreciate the offer, but I'd need assurances that this isn't just window dressing. Real change requires transparency, resources, and enforcement mechanisms. All negotiable points, Judge Montgomery replied. We're serious about addressing these issues, Mr. Wilson. Eleanor studied Anthony's face. You don't have to decide immediately. Actually, Anthony said, I think I do. He looked around the table. My interview with Channel 7 will air tonight. I focused on systemic issues, not just my personal experience. If I accept this position, the public might perceive it as the system buying my silence. Commissioner Harris frowned. That wasn't our intent. I believe you, Anthony replied. But perception matters. If we're going to do this, it needs to be above suspicion. He paused, considering his next words carefully. I'll accept the position on one condition: the task force's work must be completely transparent to the public. Regular updates, open meetings, published findings. The commissioner and judge exchanged glances. That's unusual, Harris began. It's essential, Anthony countered. Trust has been broken. Rebuilding it requires complete transparency. A tense silence filled the room as the others considered his condition. Judge Montgomery was the first to break the silence. Transparency has its merits, but there are practical considerations. Some discussions involve personnel matters that legally must remain confidential. I understand that, Anthony acknowledged. But the overall process, findings, and recommendations should be public. We can work within legal constraints while still maintaining the spirit of openness. Commissioner Harris drummed his fingers on the table. The police union will push back. Let them, Anthony replied evenly. This isn't about making everyone comfortable. It's about restoring public trust. Eleanor had been quiet, observing the exchange. Now she spoke. Anthony's right. Half measures won't address the core issues. If we're serious about reform, we need to be willing to face resistance. Commissioner Harris sighed, then nodded slowly. All right. Transparency it is. But I want to be clear, this will be challenging. You'll face opposition from multiple directions. I'm aware, Anthony said. But nothing worthwhile comes easily. The meeting concluded with a handshake agreement. The formal announcement of the task force would come next week, after the details were finalized. As they left the building, Eleanor touched Anthony's arm. "That interview is going to air tonight, while all this is still in motion," she reminded him. "Are you prepared for the reaction?" "I think so," Anthony replied, though uncertainty flickered across his face. That evening, Anthony sat in his living room, watching as his interview played on the evening news. Tyler had done a fair job editing the segment, keeping the focus on systemic issues rather than sensationalizing Anthony's personal experience. His phone began buzzing with messages as the segment aired. Colleagues expressing support. Friends checking in. A few anonymous messages with less supportive sentiments. Then came a call from his mother. "I saw you on the news," she said, her voice a mix of pride and concern. "You spoke well." "Thanks, Mom." "Your father would be proud," she added quietly. A lump formed in Anthony's throat. "I'm not sure I've accomplished anything yet." "You stood up. That's the first step." Her voice carried decades of wisdom. "Just be careful, baby. Systems don't change easily, and those who challenge them often pay a price." "I know, Mom." After they hung up, Anthony stepped onto his balcony, gazing at the city lights. His phone buzzed again, a text from an unknown number. "Just saw you on the news. I was pulled over by that same officer last month. No one listened to my complaint. Thank you for speaking up." A minute later, another message from a different number. "My son was arrested by Reynolds last year. Case was dismissed but job lost because of it. Who do I contact about this task force?" Then another. And another. Anthony leaned against the railing, scrolling through message after message from people sharing similar experiences. Some with Reynolds specifically, others with different officers across the city. Each story unique, yet following the same troubling pattern. He had expected backlash. He hadn't expected this flood of validation, painful proof that his experience was far from isolated. The task ahead suddenly felt both more daunting and more urgent. Anthony took a deep breath of the night air. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. 6 months later, Anthony stood at a podium in City Hall's main conference room. Camera flashes punctuated the murmur of gathered reporters, community leaders, and government officials. "Today, the Joint Police Accountability Task Force is releasing our comprehensive report and recommendations," Anthony announced, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "After reviewing hundreds of cases, interviewing officers and citizens alike, and analyzing departmental policies, we've identified clear patterns of biased policing and specific measures to address them." He glanced at the faces around him. Commissioner Harris sat in the front row, expression unreadable. Captain Russell stood near the back, arms crossed. Eleanor and Judge Montgomery flanked Anthony at the podium, a visual representation of institutional cooperation. "Our findings weren't easy to face," Anthony continued. "We documented significant racial disparities in traffic stops, searches, and use of force. But we also found officers hungry for better training, clearer guidelines, and a culture that rewards integrity over statistics." Anthony outlined the key recommendations: body cameras for all officers, a civilian oversight board with real authority, revised use of force policies, and mandatory bias training. Most significantly, a new transparent tracking system for officer complaints would be implemented and made public. "Officer Reynolds was terminated 3 months ago," Anthony noted. "But this was never about one officer. This is about building a system where accountability is the norm, not the exception." As the press conference concluded, Anthony found himself surrounded by people sharing their stories. A young law student thanked him for creating new internship opportunities with the task force. An elderly man gripped his hand, whispering that his grandson had recently received a long-overdue apology from the department. Later that evening, Anthony drove the same route where he'd been pulled over that night. The memory was still sharp, but it no longer carried the same sting. That incident had opened a door he might never have found otherwise. His phone rang through the car speakers. It was Tyler from Channel 7. "Impressive work today," the reporter said. "What's next for you?" Anthony smiled slightly. "The recommendations are just words on paper until they're implemented. The real work is making sure they lead to actual change." "And after that?" Tyler pressed. Anthony watched the road ahead, streetlights illuminating the path forward. "There's always more work to do. This city is just the beginning." As he drove through the night, his father's words echoed in his mind, "Justice isn't a destination. It's a journey we choose every day."